The air inside the Reich Chancellery tasted of cigar smoke and certainty on that warm afternoon in July 1940. Hermann Göring stood before Adolf Hitler wearing the kind of smile that only absolute confidence can produce. Outside those heavy walls, Europe lay conquered. Poland had fallen in weeks. France had collapsed in a matter of days that still seemed impossible to comprehend. The British army had fled across the Channel at Dunkirk, abandoning their equipment on French beaches like children dropping toys while running from a storm. And now Hitler wanted to know if his Air Force commander could finish what the Wehrmacht had started. Could the Luftwaffe destroy Britain's Royal Air Force and open the skies for invasion? Göring didn't hesitate. He gave Hitler a promise that would echo through history not as a triumph, but as a warning about the dangers of believing your own mythology. Göring told the Führer that the RAF would be swept from British skies within days. Perhaps a week at most. His Luftwaffe had proven itself unstoppable across Europe. His pilots were veterans hardened by campaigns in Spain, Poland, and France. His bombers could carry destruction to any target. His fighters were modern and deadly. The British, he assured Hitler, were exhausted, demoralized, and outnumbered. Their air force was a shadow barely clinging to existence after the beating it had taken during the French campaign. One concentrated assault, Göring promised, and the RAF would simply cease to exist as a fighting force. Then the invasion barges could cross the Channel unopposed, and Britain would join the list of nations that had learned not to stand against the Third Reich. Hitler listened to these assurances and made his decision. The invasion would proceed, but first the Luftwaffe would need to clear the skies. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, would depend entirely on Göring delivering what he had promised. What happened next would become one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in military history, a disaster that began not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of small assumptions that seemed reasonable at the time. Göring genuinely believed his own assessment. He looked at the numbers and saw a Luftwaffe that possessed nearly 3,000 aircraft ready for operations. He saw bomber formations that had terrorized cities across Europe. He saw fighter squadrons that had achieved air superiority wherever they flew. He looked across the Channel and saw a Royal Air Force that had lost hundreds of aircraft in France, that operated from a small island with limited resources, that seemed to be on the edge of collapse. Every piece of intelligence, every report from reconnaissance flights, every calculation made by his staff seemed to support the conclusion that Britain's air defenses were fragile and ready to break. But intelligence can tell you how many planes your enemy has without revealing whether those planes are being used wisely. Numbers can show you aircraft losses without explaining whether those losses matter. And confidence can blind you to the possibility that your opponent might have advantages you haven't bothered to look for. The Luftwaffe began its assault in early August 1940 with attacks designed to draw out and destroy RAF Fighter Command. Göring's strategy seemed straightforward enough. Send bomber formations escorted by fighters to attack targets the British would have to defend. When RAF fighters rose to intercept, the German fighters would destroy them. Keep repeating this process until the RAF simply ran out of planes and pilots. Then bomb Britain into submission and prepare for invasion. The first few days seemed to confirm Göring's predictions. German formations crossed the Channel and struck at coastal convoys, at harbor facilities, at radar stations along the English coast. RAF fighters scrambled to meet them, and aerial battles erupted over the Channel and southern England. Luftwaffe pilots returned to their bases and occupied France, claiming kills and reporting that British resistance was scattered and ineffective. The reports flowed into Göring's headquarters, painting a picture of an enemy air force that was fighting hard but clearly losing the exchange. Everything seemed to be proceeding exactly as planned. But something strange was happening that Göring's intelligence officers either didn't notice or didn't understand. Despite the losses being inflicted on RAF Fighter Command, despite the claims of German pilots who genuinely believed they were winning, British fighters kept appearing in the sky. Every day the Luftwaffe crossed the Channel. RAF squadrons rose to meet them. The resistance wasn't weakening. If anything, it was becoming more effective, more coordinated, more precise. Bomber formations that expected to encounter scattered opposition found themselves intercepted by carefully positioned fighter squadrons that seemed to know exactly where they were going and when they would arrive. German fighter pilots who thought they were hunting a wounded animal discovered they were fighting an opponent that refused to behave like a defeated force. And the casualties began to mount in ways that intelligence reports hadn't predicted. The truth that Göring failed to grasp was that Britain had built a defensive system unlike anything that had ever existed in warfare. It wasn't just about the number of planes or the skill of pilots, though both mattered enormously. It was about integration, about taking multiple technologies and human elements, and weaving them into a coherent whole that was far more effective than the sum of its parts. The British had created the world's first integrated air defense network, a system that combined radar stations along the coast, observer posts scattered across the countryside, fighter control rooms buried underground, and radio communication that linked everything together in real time. When German bombers formed up over France, British radar detected them while they were still climbing. When they crossed the channel, observers tracked them and reported their positions. When they approached the English coast, controllers in operations rooms studied plotting tables showing exactly where the enemy was and where they were heading, then scrambled fighter squadrons from the airfields most advantageously positioned to intercept. By the time Luftwaffe formations reached their targets, RAF fighters were already climbing to altitude, already positioned to attack, already coordinated in a way that made them far more effective than they would have been fighting individually. Göring knew that Britain had radar. German intelligence had reported the strange towers along the English coast, but he fundamentally misunderstood what radar meant in practice. He thought of it as an early warning system, a way for the British to know an attack was coming. What he didn't grasp was that radar wasn't just about warning, it was about efficiency. It meant that RAF fighters didn't have to waste fuel and pilot endurance flying constant patrols hoping to stumble across enemy formations. It meant they could stay on the ground until needed, which meant pilots got more rest between missions and planes required less maintenance. It meant that when fighters did take off, they were being directed to exactly where they needed to be rather than searching blindly. It meant that a smaller force could be used far more effectively than a larger force that lacked such coordination. Göring looked at the numbers and saw that he had more planes than the RAF. What he didn't see was that the British were using their planes 3 or 4 times more efficiently than he was using his. The Luftwaffe kept hammering away at targets across southern England throughout August, and Göring kept receiving reports that told him what he wanted to hear. His pilots were brave and often accurate when reporting what they saw, but what they saw wasn't the complete picture. When a German fighter pilot shot down a British Spitfire and watched it spiral toward the ground trailing smoke, he had no way of knowing whether the pilot bailed out safely or died in the crash. He had no way of knowing whether that pilot would be flying again in days or was lost forever. He certainly had no way of knowing that RAF pilots who survived being shot down over England could be back in the air almost immediately, while German pilots who bailed out over England spent the rest of the war in prisoner-of-war camps. The mathematics of attrition looked very different depending on whose pilots were fighting over their own territory. Göring also failed to understand the industrial reality behind the numbers he was seeing. British aircraft production had been ramped up to levels that German intelligence consistently underestimated. Factories across Britain were producing new fighters faster than the Luftwaffe was destroying them. The RAF was actually growing stronger during the battle, not weaker. Meanwhile, German aircraft production, while substantial, wasn't keeping pace with losses. Every bomber that went down over England was gone forever. Every fighter destroyed in combat took weeks to replace. And the Luftwaffe was fighting at the end of a supply line that stretched back to factories in Germany, while the RAF was fighting over home territory where damaged planes could sometimes be repaired and returned to service. Göring was waging a battle of attrition against an opponent who was better positioned to sustain attrition, but his intelligence assessments kept telling him he was winning because they measured the wrong things. Then came the week that would shatter Göring's promise to Hitler. It arrived in late August and early September when Göring, frustrated by the RAF's refusal to collapse, changed his strategy. He ordered massive daylight raids against airfields and aircraft factories, throwing hundreds of bombers into the sky escorted by even more fighters. These weren't the scattered attacks of early August. These were concentrated hammer blows designed to crush RAF fighter command through sheer overwhelming force. Göring believed he was delivering the knockout punch that would finish the campaign. Instead, he was about to discover that promises made in confidence sound very different when reality starts sending bills. The raids were enormous. On some days, German formations numbering over 1,000 aircraft crossed into British airspace in waves. The bombing was devastating. Airfields were cratered. Hangars burned. Control facilities were damaged. The RAF was being pushed to its absolute limit, with pilots flying 4 and 5 missions a day, with ground crews working around the clock to repair damaged aircraft, with everyone involved operating on the edge of exhaustion. For Göring, watching from his headquarters in France, this looked like the victory he had promised. Reports came in describing successful bombing runs, destroyed British fighters, airfields rendered unusable. It seemed like the RAF must surely break under this pressure. But the British didn't break, and the cost to the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. Day after day, German bombers limped back to French airfields with dead and wounded crew members, with holes torn through their fuselages, with engines failing and wings damaged. Fighter squadrons that crossed the channel and neat formations returned in scattered groups, counting losses and wondering how the British kept putting up such fierce resistance. The Luftwaffe was bleeding aircraft at a rate that suddenly seemed unsustainable. And then the accountants started adding up the numbers for the week, and what they found should have made Göring's blood run cold. In the span of roughly 7 days, the Luftwaffe lost over 500 aircraft to all causes including combat, accidents, and aircraft damaged beyond repair. 500 planes gone in a single week. The exact figure varied depending on how you counted damaged aircraft and whether you included planes lost to accidents, but the magnitude was unmistakable. This wasn't a sustainable rate of loss. This wasn't what Göring had promised Hitler. This was disaster dressed up in daily reports that tried to maintain optimism by claiming even higher British losses that turned out to be wildly exaggerated. The human cost behind those numbers was equally staggering. Hundreds of aircrew members were dead, wounded, or captured. These weren't easily replaced pilots fresh from training. These were experienced combat aviators, men who had flown in Spain and Poland and France, veterans who represented years of training and operational knowledge. When a bomber went down, it often took 6 or 7 crew members with it. When fighters were destroyed, skilled pilots were lost. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging the very expertise that had made it so effective in earlier campaigns, and there was no way to quickly rebuild that human capital. Göring tried to maintain the fiction that everything was proceeding according to plan. He told his commanders that victory was near, that the RAF was on the verge of collapse, that just a little more pressure would break British resistance. He blamed his own subordinates for the losses, claiming they weren't pressing attacks aggressively enough or that tactics needed adjustment. He changed targeting priorities, shifting from airfields to radar stations to aircraft factories, as if the problem was simply that he hadn't found the right target yet. What he wouldn't acknowledge was that his fundamental assumptions about the campaign had been wrong from the beginning. The RAF, meanwhile, was certainly suffering. Fighter command had lost aircraft and pilots at alarming rates. Some squadrons were down to a handful of operational fighters. Pilots were flying while exhausted to the point of collapse. Airfields were damaged and operations disrupted. But fighter command hadn't broken because it didn't need to win in any conventional sense. It just needed to continue existing, to keep putting fighters in the air, to make the Luftwaffe pay such a high price for every mission that the campaign became unsustainable. And that's exactly what was happening. The turning point came when Göring made a decision that seemed logical at the time but proved to be strategically catastrophic. Frustrated by his inability to destroy fighter command and stung by a British bombing raid on Berlin that humiliated him personally, Göring shifted the Luftwaffe's focus away from British airfields and toward London itself. He would bomb the British capital, he decided, and force the RAF to commit everything to defending it. This would draw out the remaining British fighters and allow his forces to destroy them in the air over London. It would also terrorize the British population and demonstrate German power. Hitler approved the change enthusiastically, eager to retaliate for the Berlin raid and believing that bombing cities would break British morale. What Göring didn't realize was that by shifting away from attacking airfields and toward attacking London, he was giving the RAF exactly the breathing room it desperately needed. Fighter command's airfields had been taking a tremendous beating. Control facilities were damaged. Communications were disrupted. Some stations were barely operational. A few more weeks of concentrated attacks on those facilities might actually have crippled fighter command's ability to coordinate defenses. But when the Luftwaffe turned toward London, those airfields got a chance to recover. Damaged runways were repaired. Wrecked buildings were rebuilt. Communications were restored. Fighter command regained its operational effectiveness just as Göring was claiming he was about to deliver the final blow. The shift to bombing London, which became known as the Blitz, was devastating for British civilians but strategically ineffective for winning air superiority. German bombers had to fly farther into British airspace to reach London, which meant they spent more time under attack from RAF fighters and burned more fuel, leaving less time over the target. The raids inflicted terrible damage on London and killed thousands of civilians, but they didn't force fighter command to commit resources in ways that made it vulnerable. RAF controllers could see the German formations coming on radar, could judge their likely targets, and could position fighters to intercept without having to defend every possible target. The Luftwaffe was flying deeper into British airspace, staying longer in defended areas, and achieving less strategically than they had been achieving when attacking airfields. And still the losses mounted. September saw the Luftwaffe continue to bleed aircraft at rates that made the promises Göring had made to Hitler look increasingly absurd. German fighter pilots were becoming demoralized, flying escort missions for bombers deep into enemy territory while British fighters picked apart their formations. Bomber crews dreaded the missions that seemed to accomplish little, while friends disappeared in flames. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility, which had sustained German morale through earlier campaigns, was crumbling under the reality that the British refused to be defeated. Hitler was growing impatient. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, kept being postponed because Göring couldn't deliver the air superiority he had promised. The Wehrmacht had assembled invasion barges along the French coast. Troops were trained and ready. Plans were made. But none of it could proceed while the RAF remained an active threat. German naval commanders warned that attempting a channel crossing while British fighters controlled the skies would be suicide. The invasion fleet would be torn apart by RAF bombers. The whole operation depended on Göring keeping his promise, and it was becoming increasingly clear that he couldn't. By late September, even Göring could no longer maintain the fiction. The Luftwaffe had lost over 1,000 aircraft since the campaign began. Pilot losses were mounting. Operational readiness was declining. The RAF, contrary to all predictions, remained a viable fighting force. Intelligence reports that had confidently claimed British fighter strength was down to a few dozen operational aircraft turned out to be wildly wrong. The British were still putting hundreds of fighters in the air. Göring had promised quick victory and delivered prolonged stalemate at best, strategic defeat at worst. Hitler's response to this failure was subtle at first but devastating in its long-term implications. He stopped relying on Göring's assessments of air power. He stopped giving the Luftwaffe chief the kind of direct access and influence he had enjoyed earlier in the war. He began to doubt other promises Göring made. The relationship between Hitler and his once favored Air Force commander had been built on a foundation of shared victories and Göring's apparent ability to deliver results. When that foundation cracked during the Battle of Britain, it never fully healed. Göring would remain in his position, would continue to command the Luftwaffe, would retain his titles and medals, but he would never again possess the absolute confidence of the Führer. The failure over Britain rippled outward through German strategic planning in ways that would affect the entire course of the war. When Hitler turned his attention eastward toward the Soviet Union, he did so partly because the quick victory in the West that was supposed to include Britain had failed to materialize. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely in October 1940, and Britain remained unconquered, a thorn in Germany's side, a base for future Allied operations, a symbol that the Third Reich could be resisted. The entire trajectory of the war shifted because Göring couldn't keep a promise he should never have made with such certainty. What made the failure particularly striking was that it wasn't caused by a single dramatic mistake or an unforeseen disaster. It was caused by systematic misunderstanding of what the battle would actually entail. Göring misunderstood the effectiveness of British air defense systems. He misunderstood British industrial capacity. He misunderstood pilot replacement rates. He misunderstood the strategic importance of fighting over enemy territory versus friendly territory. He misunderstood how morale and attrition interact in air warfare. He believed his own intelligence reports when they told him what he wanted to hear and dismissed warning signs that suggested the campaign wasn't proceeding as planned. Each individual misunderstanding might have been survivable. Together, they created a cascade of wrong decisions that turned a campaign Göring thought would last days into a months-long battle of attrition he couldn't win. The British, for their part, came far closer to defeat than post-war mythology often acknowledges. Fighter command was stretched to its absolute limits during the worst weeks of the battle. A few different decisions by Göring, particularly if he had maintained focus on airfields instead of shifting to London, might have broken the defensive system. But the British had advantages they used brilliantly, and they were fighting for survival in a way that focused minds wonderfully. When Göring was making promises to Hitler about quick victory, the British were building a defensive network designed not for quick victory but for stubborn survival. When German intelligence was underestimating British production and overestimating British losses, the British were counting every plane and every pilot and stretching their resources to extract maximum effectiveness. When Göring was changing strategies in search of a knockout blow, the British were grimly holding on and making the Germans pay in blood for every mile of British airspace. The week when Göring lost 500 planes wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment when a promise made in absolute confidence shattered against reality. Göring had stood before Hitler and guaranteed that the RAF would be destroyed in days. He had built his assurances on intelligence that was flawed, on assumptions that were wrong, on confidence that exceeded capability. And when the bills came due, when the losses mounted, when the RAF refused to disappear, Göring discovered that promises made to Hitler weren't easily forgiven when they proved to be empty. The Battle of Britain officially continued through October 1940, but the decisive moment had already passed. The Luftwaffe shifted increasingly toward night bombing, tacitly admitting that daylight operations were too costly. The invasion of Britain was quietly shelved, never to be seriously attempted. Germany began looking eastward toward the Soviet Union, planning an invasion of Russia that would ultimately lead to even greater disasters. And Göring, the man who had promised quick victory, found himself diminished in influence and trust, his reputation permanently tarnished by the failure to deliver what he had assured Hitler was easily achievable. The story of Göring's promise and its catastrophic failure contains lessons that echo far beyond the specific circumstances of 1940. It demonstrates the danger of strategic planning based on wishful thinking rather than careful analysis. It shows how technological and systematic advantages can overcome numerical superiority. It reveals how fighting on your own territory, where every advantage of logistics and morale and recovery favors you, can offset tremendous disadvantages in raw numbers. It illustrates how misunderstanding your opponent's capabilities and will to resist can turn what looks like certain victory into unexpected defeat. For Britain, the victory in the Battle of Britain was survival at a moment when survival seemed uncertain. It prevented invasion. It proved that Nazi Germany could be resisted and fought to a standstill. It bought time for Britain to reorganize, to bring the empire's resources to bear, to eventually welcome the Americans as allies. The battle didn't win the war, but it prevented Britain from losing the war in 1940, and that made everything that followed possible. For Germany, the failure marked the beginning of a long decline from the heights of 1940 when the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. The aura of invincibility was broken. The strategy of quick victories through overwhelming force met an opponent who refused to cooperate with that script. And Göring, the man whose promises had helped fuel Hitler's ambitions, became a figure diminished by his inability to deliver, forever remembered not for his earlier successes but for the promise he made and catastrophically failed to keep. In the end, what destroyed Göring's promise wasn't just British resistance or RAF fighter pilots or radar stations or industrial production, though all of those mattered enormously. What destroyed his promise was the gap between what he believed was true and what was actually true, between what he thought would happen and what actually happened, between the confidence with which he made assurances and the reality of what delivering those assurances would require. He promised Hitler he could win, then lost 500 planes in a week, and in doing so lost something far more valuable than aircraft. He lost credibility, he lost influence, and he helped lose the war.